welcome to the Ruby Source podcast. Today, I'm joined by Nick Alpi. Nick is CTO at Amber Health. Welcome to the show, Nick. Thanks for joining me.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me.
Of course, good. So the past few episodes that I've recorded, I've started by very much early on in your career, talking about how you got into programming, how you started working with Ruby, when you started working with Ruby, those sorts of things. So let's start from there really, and tell me a bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, my love for programming, as a lot of old folks, kind of like started when I was young. I probably started programming when I was like in my very early teens. I was coding some games in BASIC and then moved very quickly to like, at the time was Visual Basic was all the rage, essentially, just because you could drag and drop stuff and get something up on a screen quickly. I was always tinkering with one app or another. Usually the apps that we're building were mostly related to a problem I had at hands. So, for example, when I was a teenager, my mum, she's a cleaner, and she had this interview for like a job as a secretary. So she would have to work on a computer and everything, which at the time was a new thing to her. And she would have to learn how to type. So I coded these very quick games to teach her how to touch type, essentially. Like it was a cat trying to catch a mouse, and you had some phrases. And you would the faster you type, the faster the mouse was moving, or something like that.
Nice.
And it kind of got me into the realm of like building to solve a problem. Weirdly enough, I went through in a very early age. Somebody was interested to buy that software, and then we got to certain negotiations and stuff like that. It was selling through like families and friends kind of stuff. I got a Post-it note application that was featured in one of those, like at the time we had a lot of reviews and magazines talking about PCs and computer and new programs and sharewares and everything. That one was a license that was called a cardware. So essentially people had to, if they were using the software, they would have to send me a postcard of where they lived. I didn't know it was featured in this magazine because email was no big thing at the time. So nobody let me know that was featured there. But then all of a sudden I started to receive like tens of postcards every day from various places in France, because it was a French magazine. So it was kind of cool, but it was always attached to a particular problem I had at the time. That was my way of tinkering with things. Then I started to I quit school, and then I started to work as a freelance, building at the time like simple websites for businesses. Like the web was booming, everybody wanted a website. Like every single person at the time, I rebuilt my own CMS thinking I was very clever. WordPress and all that didn't exist. So essentially it was magical for people because they had a website and they could automatically change stuff without having to call me or pay me to change an image on the homepage or whatever. It was a very, very simple CMS. I completely missed the boat with like WordPress, Joomla kind of coming up. I was completely blinded by the fact that I was building a CMS. I don't need those tools. And it turns out, obviously, that was the wrong choice. Then I started to work a couple of years later. I started to work in a medical software company. And the deal was that I was a PHP, like quite a senior PHP dev at the time. They just acquired a startup that had a heavy, large PHP application, and we're going to work into like refactoring and rebuilding some part of this application. And the more I was building on this app, it was like essentially a CRUD application. And the more I was building on this app, and the more I was like, there has to be something better to build this kind of thing. And that's when like Ruby on Rails, which at the time was like Ruby on Rails version 1 point something, 1.1, 1.2, started to come up, like few various magazines and everything. And that's when I started to install Rails. And since then I said, that's what I want to work on, essentially. Like that's the kind of software, that's the kind of ethos in building software that I want to embrace. I've tried wrongly. I've tried, so maybe we should rebuild the whole thing in Rails. That would have been terrible. Luckily, I had a much more experienced and intelligent person running the company. that said, no, we're not rewriting. But still, Rails was in the background. I was tinkering along. Then I moved from France to the UK. I worked again another year here to settle down. I worked another year with HP over here. And then I started to work as a contractor in Ruby on Rails. And I think since then, so probably like 15 years ago, 15, 16 years ago, Ruby on Rails has been probably the only thing I've been doing essentially. As we're going to talk about a bit more later, after that, I've ran an agency and a consultancy that was focused solely on Ruby on Rails, and it's been my passion. I mean, I've tried a lot of different things, and I still can't shake the fact that as much as there are other tools that are very suited to like very specific part of the web, there's nothing better than Rails essentially. The new tools like Laravel and everything are fantastic if you are a PHP dev, but obviously coming from the muscle memory of knowing Ruby and all the paradigms of Ruby, there's nothing better than Ruby on Rails still to these days to build a new product essentially.
What is it about Ruby and Rails that actually attracts you to like you said, you're going back to working with it, or always working with it, as opposed to moving on to something that's like new kid on the block tech like Go or whatever? What is it about Ruby that is keeping you from moving away?
The Ruby itself. So if we separate Rails and Ruby here for a second, what's for me really attractive to Ruby as a so English is not my first language. I'm French. English is not my first language.
Sure.
And I'm wondering if because the creator of Ruby, English was not his first language either. This idea that you can express yourself in very simple words that actually you can almost read a Ruby code, a good written Ruby code. You can read it like you would read a book. Essentially, it's very explicit when you read Ruby code, even if you're not a programmer. You can roughly understand what's going on. Like
sure.
If I give you methods and you know roughly like a couple of words that are important here, it's written in a plain language. It's not written with cryptic functions name like PHP could be or Go, whatever. Like it's written in the plain Ruby, which makes it for me extremely simple to approach, extremely simple to express yourself. And as a non-native English speaker, it makes it also easier to read other people's code. Essentially, it's not something you don't. It's a really bizarre thing where you don't have to learn something new. You kind of like go along with words that do make sense, and you express your code in words that do make sense. And that's personally a feature I love of the language.
Yeah. Okay. You mentioned the agency that you started, which, if people are listening or viewing or watching rather, don't know, it was called Cookies HQ. Tell us a bit more about starting. When you came to the UK, you started Cookies, and tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, I think there was a bit more. So first I started as a freelance. So I was a classic contractor doing Ruby for other people. As I said early on, like I've always had a knack about solving problems, and I started to land myself as in Bristol, the freelance where you would go to build something new. So I was working very much in the startup ecosystem. And my first contract as a freelance was with an established kind of like startup scale up. But after that, every single contract I seemed to land was like people that wanted a new thing, a new app. They wanted to build something new. They wanted to like have a prototype and try to go and raise money and all this kind of jazz. So I started as a contractor in 2009, but in 2011, after two years of contracting, my wife Natalie she was looking for a new job at the time, and she's classically trained around like marketing. And I thought, well, look, I'm working with a lot of startups. These people essentially sometimes struggle to understand the basics of marketing. the basics of like how to measure whether you're doing and where you're going with your product. So I thought, why don't we start something together? You work on the marketing side, I work on the coding side, and essentially we have a new offering that at the time was not really really out there, this kind of like joint thing. We never managed to do that. We never managed to have this kind of like people didn't buy the whole thing. Like if I want a marketing agency, I go and buy, I go and
Yeah.
work with a marketing agency or marketing freelance. If I want a dev, I want a good dev essentially. But
Yeah.
it turns out Nat had been extremely good at everything around like being an MD essentially. So we grew, we took along, we had some kids along the way. So for the first couple of years of the Cookies life, it was very much a lifestyle business in the sense that it was I was not a freelance anymore. We had a couple of employees, but we were not rushing to grow. We were not looking for that like hyper growth at all cost. We were having kids. It was giving us a nice lifestyle. We were able to work with people that we really liked. And that was it. Essentially, that was Cookies was going to think along with around like 4 or 5 people in the team, and it was easy enough to support. We had enough clients for everything. But after probably 5 years, I would say, so Cookies lasted around 11 years in total, but after 5-6 years, it started to grow a bit old. Like the kids were there, the kids were like established and growing up. And our desire to see what we could do next, like where could we go with a larger consultancy, a larger company, was there. I tried early on to drive that growth, and I've learned I'm terrible at driving that growth because while I'm interested in everything marketing and business related, I'm really bad at focusing on something, and that's where Natalie stepped in as the role of the MD, and she put us in a trajectory that shows like these kind of like growth that we had over a span of like 3-4 years essentially. So that's where we kind of grew, and we grew the company to be I think at the end we were about 17 people or something like that, with a bunch of like front end, back end, QA analysts and designers. So it was a really cool team to work with, and we were building some really amazing product. Like that's the thing with Cookies. We've always been quite picky about who we would work with. And it worked really well for us because we managed to sometimes say no to things that we really don't want, put us in a very tricky position, but somehow magically around the corner, like this new cool product appear. And we've been able to work on some really, really nice startup with some amazing founders.
And so one of you, I know obviously because we've spoken and we know each other, but Amber, where you are CTO, was a client of yours. You built Amber's product, right?
Yes. So the whole transition. So essentially, the weird thing with an agency is, while it's a good business to run an agency business, and I know some people don't like it because you sell your time, and now all the rage is around monthly recurring revenues and having a product and all that. But I love service business, and you probably understand that as well.
Yeah.
Like this idea of service business is, I think, sometimes overlooked. From a business perspective, it's easy enough to start, it's a low cost, and it's easy enough to scale to a certain point. The problem of service business is it's very difficult to exit, and it's always been very difficult for us to think about what could an exit looks like. We were in 2000 towards the end of 2009, we were starting to think about this mythical idea of like, okay, what if we wanted to exit? And clearly there was a couple of paths that emerged. The first one was that we've always had this dream that essentially at some point a client that we would have built the project on was going to raise some money and would acquire Cookies essentially, and it would have to be like a project that we believed on and all this kind of jazz. But there was that mythical thing early on. The problem is the more you grow, the less it makes sense for that to happen, because obviously they're not going to spend a lot of money buying a team where they don't need it. So that was kind of like in the back burner, and we don't think it would have happened. But we started to put in place, like we knew that the problem was that I was the face of cookies, and that was a problem. We needed to remove me out of like the cookies face in order for cookies to be a brand, and in order to like grow organically as a brand rather than like me growing cookies. And we started to put some managers in place and all that, like as typical organization would do. And we got contacted by another Ruby on Rails consultancy in the UK that made us an offer. Was interested to essentially join Venture Cookies and their company, and would have been like a massive 100 people kind of consultancy in the UK. While it was interesting, the offer was interesting. We essentially, why would I work for somebody else doing what I do here? Like, I would have just continued doing that. But it's still something that we considered extremely strongly. But at the same time, we were about to embark into the Amber project, and the Amber founder, Stuart Hamilton, he's been a client of ours for like 10 years. He's been a friend, and he also knows a thing or two about business, having done some pretty big exit in his time. And I was talking to him about what was happening right now, the offer that we had from the other agency. And we've always dreamt about doing something together. Like, it's somebody that I respect extremely. And I wanted to learn from him firsthand, essentially. And that's when he came back and said, well, look, why don't we, Amber, the company, acquires cookies, and we build Amber together. And I think essentially he called us like, when I probably get the timing wrong, but he called us on the Friday afternoon with this idea, like setting the seed of the idea in our heads. And by the Sunday evening, after a few calls over the weekend, we were like, yep, let's do it. It makes complete sense. It was an interesting next move, completely unconventional. It was an interesting next move, so we could build what Amber is today, like this fantastic product that Amber is, something that we could never have dreamt if we were still just cookies, essentially working as an agency on the product. Like, we've been able to really dive into the product like you would never do with a consultancy.
What's your preference, you think, on working agency where you're working on multiple products to working for a product company?
That's interesting. So the difference when you work on your own product compared to a consultancy is that you can really dive. You can allow yourself to really embrace the problems, try a few things out, and hopefully like find a solution at the end and apply the correct solution that you think of at the time. With a consultancy, it's a lot more related to time. Like, everything is about how much you're going to get paid and how much money you're going to spend, and that's where your profit is in the differential between the two. So I think that idea of being able to deep dive into problems is something I really enjoy. I do miss time to time I do miss there were two things. Obviously, when I was running cookies with Nat, I was handling multiple hats, which I've kind of lost, obviously, now being just simply the CTO of Amber. I've lost the hat of like running a bit of the marketing, running a bit of the numbers and all that. Like, it's that part is a bit lost. And the fact that before there was always like a couple of projects on the go, and my mind really likes this idea of moving from left to right and changing projects. And for the early days of Amber, it was missing a little bit of that left and right thing. But the more we grow, the more we have now. And that's what I probably missed early on. We now have multiple projects inside Amber, which kind of like quench my thirst of looking for that moving left and right, and spending a morning on one problem, spending an afternoon on another problem kind of thing. That's what I really like.
So let's finish off by you telling us a bit more about the situation at Amber, if you guys are hiring, and obviously how people can get in touch with you if they're interested in hearing a bit more or talking to you directly.
Yeah, sure. So as far as Amber is concerned, you can learn more by going to www.amber.co. So that's amba.co. So that's the general kind of like marketing-ish website. We have a career section over there where we will list all our jobs. Currently, we have fulfilled every single job that we were looking for at the moment, but we are closing a new round of funding. So I would not be surprised if in the next couple of months we're going to have a little bit more offering open. I know that we want a designer to join our team. We probably would be looking at some point for a business analyst, and as you would expect, like a couple of developers, front end, back end. In order to keep in touch and in order to know about that, obviously you can go through all the usual channels, so like following Amber, the company Amber on LinkedIn or Twitter or these kind of things. You can also follow me personally. So I'm Nicholas Alpi on LinkedIn. I'm Nick Alpi on Twitter. I'm Nick Alpi as well on Instagram, but I'm pretty sure you don't care about pictures of my kids. But essentially, I normally will put updates of what we are looking for on one of those channels, typically LinkedIn and Twitter. Would be the same one. I am trying right now a new app called Substacks, which is very interesting, not for updates, but just as a general thing. So I may be a little bit more active over there as well, depending what's happening with the craziness of Twitter. But yeah, essentially Nick Alpi, Nicholas Alpi for my personal, and I will update you on what we're looking for Amber. But as far as Amber is concerned, it's amber.co or Amber on LinkedIn and Go Amber on Twitter, I think.
Perfect. Brilliant. Nick, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure to have a chat with you today.
Thank you. Likewise, it was really nice. It felt a bit nervous going back behind the microphone, like I did a few of those podcasts, but I stopped for like a year and a half now. But it felt good. It felt good at the end.
Good stuff. All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You take care. Have a nice day.
And you.
Ta-da.
Cheers.